Hello, everyone. A very good morning to all of us, all of you joining us from the US, maybe a good afternoon to everyone who's joining us from Europe, and a good evening to everyone who's joining us from India and Asia today. Welcome to the 6th webinar session of this CAMP-IDEX Mediation Webinar Series. Today, of course, we're going to be talking about setting standards in mediation. We are a bit sad that this series is coming to an end, but they say you got to end it on a high. So it's a lovely panel that we have today, and of course, a brilliant topic to talk about. So I'm going to get straight to it and start introducing you to the panelists today. First up, I think I'll start with the hero among the heroines. I'm sorry, Professor Aragaki, but I've been really wanting to say this for quite some time now. Of course, Professor Aragaki is an arbitrator, a mediator, and a neutral evaluator with JAMS. He is an internationally recognized expert in the arbitration and mediation field who has trained judges and lawyers and is frequently called upon to consult on ADR reform projects around the world. Very interestingly, though, he was appointed as an advisor to the legislation drafting committee here in India, which was formed by the Supreme Court of India earlier this year. Mr. Aragaki is a tenured professor of law at the Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and a professional research associate at the SOAS School of Law in London. He's a citizen of the US and Japan, and of course, an overseas citizen of India. So he's very much part of the family here with us. And of course, he also brings in a rich international experience, having lived in the UK, Germany, and France. So welcome, and thank you for being with us today, Professor Aragaki.
Thanks for having me.
Next up, I'm going to introduce you to Ms. Sadhna Ramachandran, who is a senior lawyer and mediator at the Supreme Court of India. She's a member of the organizing committee of the Delhi High Court Mediation Center, which is also known as Samadhan. She's a senior vice president at Madhyam, an initiative that she played a huge role in starting a few years ago. A very interesting fact about Advocate Sadhna is that I think earlier this year, or earlier last year, it was when the Supreme Court appointed her and another senior lawyer as mediators to calm down the tensions that arose from the Shaheen Bagh protests that happened in India. And I still remember watching her live on YouTube and on all the channels. I was miles away, but it gave me goosebumps to be actually watching a mediator go out there, in this really hostile, very tense group of people who were really, really frustrated about something. And she was there with them and talking to them so calmly. It was so nice to watch that, and still gives me goosebumps to watch these videos. Welcome, Sadhna ma'am, and nice to have you with us today.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's an honor for me to be on this panel.
Thank you. Next up, we have Laura May Skillen. For all of you know, she's the executive director at the International Mediation Institute. And of course, she takes care of almost everything out there, from fundraising to communications, managing and developing the IT infrastructure and the websites. Laura originally is from Australia, but she spends her time right now in Brussels, where she's also undertaking her PhD in international relations. So thank you for taking your time off your busy PhD. I would say every second matters to you at this point of time, and yet you found some time for us today. Laura, thank you so much for being with us.
No, thank you. It's great to be here.
And finally, Tara Ollapally, who's the co-founder at CAMP. And of course, my partner in crime. She needs no introduction. She has been basically at the helm of this webinar series for quite some time now. And of course, she brings in the energy and drive behind CAMP's growth and over the last decade. A lawyer herself, qualified to practice in India and the US, she has dedicated a chunk of the last decade towards building private mediation practice back here in India through CAMP and its projects. I think one of the best abilities of Tara, and I know she's getting really overwhelmed with this, is that it's her ability to connect, to network, and to bring people together. And then after bringing them together, to get them to work on a common goal. So no better moderator than that with all the skill set. So Tara, on to you now for the next 1 hour.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's always exciting when you set the bar really high. So let's see how we go with this. But yes, thank you for introducing this wonderful panel. And it's an exciting way for us to end our mediation webinar series. And I'm going to jump right in because this is a big topic, lots of questions and a fantastic panel. So Laura, I'm going to start with you on this whole question of setting mediation standards in India. It's a hot topic in India. There's a lot of interest. The field is growing. We have many mediators, many professionals interested in getting into the space. So as the executive director of the International Mediation Institute, whose objective, the objective of the institution is to set and achieve high mediation standards worldwide. When we talk about standards, what are the essential elements or factors that must be considered as we talk about setting standards for the profession of mediation?
Absolutely, and it's a great question, and I think a very timely one in light of the changes in India. And so the first thing that I would say is actually, from an international standpoint, cultural sensitivity, and recognizing that there are different heritages and different sources of mediation. So in a way, when we talk about developing mediation standards, we need to think about almost mediating mediation, bringing all those voices together to provide input. But with that said, I mean, another question that needs to be raised is what it means to be a professional mediator, okay? Because there's a difference between someone who does it as a profession and someone who does it as part of their daily job or, part of their general approach to life. And so when we talk about a professional mediator, we need to consider things like skills, of course, but we need to consider training and experience and vetting, okay? And these are the three things that can help to differentiate someone as a professional mediator that you would turn to. So the standards would need to consider things such as these. I mean, as sort of getting back to the brass tacks, I mean, at IMI, we've set standards for training, so quality training, for trainers, coaches, and assessors, for the assessment of experienced mediators as well, and for ethics. What we don't do is prescribe the process, okay? Because of course there are many different ways of doing mediation and different mediation styles. So that, I think, we would want to be reluctant to prescribe. But I think the one final element though to consider when talking about setting standards is the idea of independence, because I think it's inconsistent to have the same body delivering training and delivering assessment and setting standards, because they have that conflict of interest there, right? The sort of the fiduciary interest. But I think those are the main things: the fundamentals, training, experience, and vetting.
Thank you, Laura. That gives us a general macro perspective of what it means to think about when we set standards. Now, Hiro, I'd like your perspective, especially considering the fact that you have been part of this mediation movement in the United States for the past 20 years as an academic, as a practitioner. From your perspective in the US, how has the community there approached or thought about setting standards for the mediation profession?
So, it's a great question, and it's a question that I think has had some renewed interest in the US. So in general, I think what's distinctive about the American approach to standards, and by standards, I'm thinking more about sort of qualifications, right? In certain countries, you have to be trained as a lawyer, you have to have had a certain amount of mediation coursework before you can be approved as a mediator. We don't have any of that in the US, at least not at the public level or the state's level. So the upshot is that anyone can hang a shingle and call themselves a mediator and start taking mediation cases, even without having done any training. Now, in practice, that's very unlikely, right? Because to actually get mediation cases, it's not an easy feat. And you typically have to be affiliated with a court program or a private institution that will actually feed you cases. But our approach in the US has essentially been to leave it up to the market to decide standards, right? So when you're thinking about kind of influencing behavior or shaping the practice of mediation, there are lots of different ways to do that. I think our instinctive approach is often to think of the law or rules or standards as ways of doing that. And that's very, very much kind of top-down approach. And I think in the US, we've had a lot of discussions about sort of what should those standards be, how should they be enforced? And the general consensus here has been that actually the market does a pretty good job at constraining behavior and sending out reputational signals. And that to some degree, to centralize all of this and make a government or maybe a non-governmental organization in charge of all of this at the macro level could actually create more problems than it's going to solve. And so it's still a very controversial, I think, position that we've wound up with in the US. There are some people who are really pushing still for some standards in the US, but largely we've relied on the market as a kind of behavior and standard constraining mechanism.
Very, very interesting, and that gives us a fantastic backdrop to bring Sadhana in as a professional who has traveled the length and breadth of this country, educating, training, mediating. How do you see standards working in India? We've heard Laura speak about it from the macro perspective in terms of an international organization, how they think about standards. We have Hiro who's sharing with us the American perspective, which is leaving it to the market to hold the standards. How do you see standards and setting standards in the Indian context playing out, Sadhana?
Tara, I'll take a little while, so allow me half a minute more than my allotted time.
Absolutely.
I appreciate Laura's, underlining the cultural aspects of standards. I think in the context of India, those are crucial. And in terms of modern mediation in India, Hiro's point about the market, yes, it's important. Ultimately, markets will decide, whatever standards you set. But India is diverse. So I want to make 3 quick points. The first one is that India is diverse. We are multicultural, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, with culture changing every 20 kilometers, food changing, language changing. So that diversity itself is a challenge to any standards. And it's a huge diversity. The second point I want to make is that, we have a heritage of mediation in India. We like to say, and we believe, that we gave mediation to the world, because we have a heritage that we have it's not just part of our history, but we've actually lived that heritage in the sense and passed it on to the next generation. So we have concepts given to us. I'm talking of 1500 BCE, 4,000 years ago. We have the concept in the Vedic period, the early Aryans giving us the concepts of reason, wisdom, and prudence. And even today, when we test a settlement, we ask the 3 questions. Is it a wise settlement? Is it an efficient settlement? Does it maintain and improve relationships? So it's come, it's that far. The next era was the era of Dharma Shastras, where tribunals were set up. And unlike the divine laws of wisdom, reason, and prudence, here the concepts of justice, equity, and good conscience were set up. And the concepts of voluntariness and participation that are such important aspects of mediation came to us in 600 BCE. 2,500 years ago, the Buddha chose mediation to be the wise choice. And he says it's the wise choice because it looks at the future. It doesn't dissect the past. Then we come to the Mughal era, where there are so many examples of Akbar's court, Emperor Akbar, whose mediator Birbal introduced to the world an integrated problem-solving approach, finding the unobvious from the obvious. We call it the Birbal approach. And stories about how Birbal helped parties to solve disputes have been passed on from my grandmother to me and to my children, and I find them doing it with their children. So that's the heritage that we have, and it's a living heritage. It was only when the British came that the concept of justice became a clear-cut decision in an adversarial system. Till then, for India, justice was mediation in so many different ways. So to go back to illustrating the diversity, I just want to take 2 examples to show you the challenges that any setting of standards can have in India, and we must recognize them and work with them. The first example I'd like to give you is from the northeastern state of Nagaland. the Chief Justice of Guwahati had asked us, the Guwahati High Court has asked us to come with an awareness program for the Northeast, especially the state of Nagaland. We went there and we thought, you know, the Nagas are a wonderful tribal community. There are 17 tribes of the Nagas in Nagaland. The rest live elsewhere. All 17 have different languages. They don't speak each other's languages. They communicate with each other, these 17 tribes, through a language called Nagamese. And this Nagamese language doesn't have a written script. And in that environment, when we went, we were really so pleasantly surprised to find that without knowing the nomenclatures of mediation, the hierarchy of the village council, then the village panchayat, and then, you know, the village appellate customary court, which coexist with the normal judicial courts. I mean, mediation was being practiced without their even knowing it. They were making the opening statement. The wise old man known as the Gaon Buddha, he gathered information. He had his joint session. He had his separate sessions, his private sessions. He unearthed interests, underlying interests of both the parties. He encouraged them to throw up options. He helped them to select options. He spoke of confidentiality, voluntariness, all the tenets of mediation. We were really surprised to find. So how do you set standards for a region that has been practicing mediation for centuries? Yes, today the challenge is how do we help them set standards to write, say, a settlement, in the writing of a settlement agreement. So that's one example. And I want to give a quick second example of a district in the state of Punjab. Now, we went there to train lawyers in mediation, and we were talking about neutrality, how it's important to set standards of neutrality. And therefore, for that, to avoid appearing for parties where you've been a mediator as a lawyer, say for a year or a year and a half or two. Now, when we were talking to them about this, they were really surprised because they said, you know, we come from it's a very poor district. There are very few educated people. There are generally farmers who till land, small bits of land. There are shopkeepers. There are hardly any graduates. We know how difficult it was for us to actually get law degrees by going long distances for years. Now we are the elders and leaders of this community. We are looked upon to write any legal documents that the people around, you know, the people of the district would like, informally, formally. We are their mentors. When they have a family problem, they come to us. When there's a family celebration, they come to us. When they need money, they come to us. When they want help in the court, well, half the time we are doing it pro bono, but we are a handful of lawyers who are looked upon as leaders by the entire community. And this community just cannot see any ethical contradiction in our knowing all of them and them knowing us. In fact, they would not like to come to a neutral person. For them, we would be the right, you know, mediators because we know the community. So, you know, so how do you set standards for specific requirements? So the point that I'm trying to make is that it is very important to decentralize. We'll talk about it, I'm sure, in the course of our discussion. To decentralize the applicability of standards when we set them in recognition of the local conditions. That is critical for India.
Absolutely. And I think those are such strong examples that you have raised in setting standards is not a uniform process, especially in a country like India with the diversity. But that said, I'm hearing there are essential concepts of, as you mentioned, wisdom, reason, prudence, trust, that form the basis for this practice, that there is a process, whether it comes intuitively or whether it comes practiced. There is a process that the mediation process prescribes that our mediators are to be followed. So absolutely, I think what we're all on the same page that there needs to be the flexibility with respect to setting of standards. But that said, there is a core that needs to be established when it comes to setting standards. Now, moving on to the next segment of our conversation on the implementation. And yes, we're talking about a more fluid, flexible process. But at the end of the day, the idea of talking about standards loses its value when we don't think through how these standards could be implemented. And there are different ways jurisdictions have approached it. For example, in the United States, it's left to the individual organization to implement standards, or in countries like Australia or Turkey, there is a strong governmental intervention, or the government body is present to be able to uphold and implement standards. And also now in light of the Singapore Convention, we're talking about, is there space for an international organization to be playing this role of guiding the implementation process? Going back to you, Hiro, what is your thought on how implementation of standards works out? And again, coming from the American perspective, how do you think this subject through?
Yeah. So, I think the Americans have maybe a slightly different take from many other countries about standard setting. I think that Sadhana really captured the idea of decentralization, which I think is maybe a better way to think about the American approach. It's not that we have no standards, it's just that there aren't any kind of public standards that are set from the top down. So of course we have many mediation providers in the US. Most of them are court-annexed mediation programs. Some of them are private mediation panels like the American Arbitration Association, which you may have heard of. They will each have their own kind of loose standards and criteria for who may become a mediator on the mediation panel, what they need to do to stay on the panel, not be subject to discipline or complaints from parties, etc., having good evaluations from the lawyers and the parties and so on. But it's a very decentralized model. And I think it's a lot of the rationale behind that reflects what Sadhana said too. We may not be as quite a culturally rich and diverse country as India, but even within an American mediation framework, there are lots of different types of mediation, right? So what works in family law, which looks very different from what works in a commercial mediation setting. In family law cases, we tend to do punctuated mediation hearings, very short, maybe 2-3 hour sessions over multiple days and weeks. In the commercial setting, it tends to be all concentrated in 1 or 2 consecutive days, right? Tara, you were saying earlier that there may be some essential features of the mediation process that we can all agree on. And I think even that is actually kind of questionable, right? So you talk to some people who say, well, no one should evaluate in mediation because mediation is supposed to be a facilitative process that empowers the parties to make their own decisions. And then others will say, well, how can you possibly not evaluate? Parties like that, that adds value, and facilitative mediation is sometimes not productive. This point that Sadhana raised about neutrality, you would think that neutrality would be a basic concept that we could all agree on, but actually it turns out that, different people in different, not just regions, but also industries and dispute types might have different feelings about that, right? So I think that's one of the reasons why in the US, we just haven't had any consensus, and it's all devolved into this more decentralized kind of a system where it's really up to the mediation provider to regulate who they admit as mediators. And then they have more control over who they can discipline and how they do that. If we're just trying to regulate ad hoc mediators out there who are largely functioning independently, I think that becomes very difficult for a public body to oversee. Now, I know in India, there are different considerations, right? So in India, I think there's more of a need for some public imprimatur to standard setting. The legitimacy that comes from having standards set from on high, I think, has a certain value in India. And we did discuss this a lot, actually, among the experts to the Mediation Legislation Drafting Committee. And although I can't really get into the details of those discussions, one concern that I would have about setting public standards and having maybe a government agency or authority be in charge of that in India is that while I think that kind of oversight at the top level is important for the legitimacy purposes that we just talked about, I think the day-to-day administration and running of those standards, who should be qualified as mediators, what happens if there's a complaint about a mediator, how will they be disciplined or possibly removed? What kinds of training programs should be required, and how can they be updated periodically to make them more relevant, and so on. That takes a lot of manpower and energy. And my concern with kind of leaving that all in the hands of a government bureaucrat is that that could become very inefficient. And if you can't follow up, right? If there's a complaint about a mediator, for example, and it takes a year to resolve that complaint and discipline the mediator or take some kind of remedial action, that can really affect the legitimacy of the standards at the end of the day if there isn't rigorous enforcement. And so that might be an argument, I think, as you're thinking about these issues in India, for maybe pursuing a hybrid type of approach where there is some announcement of what the standards are at the top level, but perhaps creating some space for private actors, institutions like IMI perhaps, or other groups that are out there to do the real day-to-day work of the accreditation and certification and training standard settings and so on. Anyhow, that's a
and actually we will be going into this in a little bit more detail, but thank you for bringing those points up. Moving it to Sadhana, Hiro's given us the American perspective. He's had the privilege to be part of the Indian discussions, and of course you, Sadhana, were part of the committee that thought through standards. How are we thinking through the implementation of standards for India? What is the loose kind of framework that would work for India?
I think Hiro has understood the Indian need for standard setting very well. I think his suggestion about a hybrid kind of body is what I think ultimately is going to work for us. So now, as far as India is concerned, it's important that standards are implemented in 3 ways. The first is obviously by a mediation act. We've all worked on it. We've been part of the expert committee, and now a proposal has gone through the Supreme Court to the government, to the central government. And we have to have in place appropriate legal sanction of this mediation act. There is a strong need for a comprehensive legislation for several things: to promote mediation, to facilitate mediation, to consolidate and amend the existing laws on mediation, to encourage private mediation, to ensure professionalism, and we are talking of standards, high standards, and to provide the platform to use mediation for a wide range of disputes, both domestic and cross-border. And this law becomes critical in the event of India having signed the Singapore Convention as well. And that law will be introduced by the government in Parliament. So government has a very major role to play as far as the standards being set by legislation is concerned. Now, let's come to the public arena. For the public arena, it is again critical to make provision for the conduct of the mediation process itself. That is fair, that is neutral, that is flexible, that is efficient, that is voluntary, that encourages self-determination of the parties capable of meeting specific requirements. And this is needed at the central level, state level, and district level, particularly with the growth of private mediation. So the implementation in the public arena of such standards is very important, and it is the capacity to decentralize setting standards in a flexible way to suit the local state requirements and district and community requirements that I was talking about earlier. All this is possible really through the government, which also under our several new legislations that have come in the last 8 years has a very important role to play. For example, in setting up under the amendment of the Companies Act, a mediation panel, etc. I can talk about it a little later when we're talking. However, I have a caveat over here. The role of the government is important, both in legislation and in the public sphere. But it's important how they do it. Now, it's important for government to play an advisory role. As Hiro said, the leadership role, the top credible factor that is going to lay down these standards. And then, so the government, what I think would work for India is that the government has an advisory role, but the government sets up an autonomous body, the representation of which is again critical. Because this body must be represented by the judiciary, by the legal profession, by government, by accomplished mediators who have done wonderful work like CAMP for the last 15 years, representation from court-IDEX mediation centers that have been running very well for a long, long time, eminent academics who have been part of research and teaching ADR and mediation, representations from commerce and industry, particularly in view of the Singapore Convention, public welfare representation from the community who are important stakeholders. But at the end of all this, what is crucial is the Federation of Indian Mediators that is on the anvil. And I call upon all our mediator, our institutions, our service providers to please put your act together. Because ultimately, at the district level, at the decentralized level of the community, the district, when the Federation of Mediators representatives work with the local government and perhaps even the local bar associations. Our Chief Justice has been talking of a mediation bar in every court. So it will have to be that kind of very, very comprehensive setup which India needs, with the government on top, with a leadership role, an advisory role that sets standards that Hiro was talking about. I think I would say it's the other way around. The accreditation, the certification will need to perhaps come from the autonomous body, and the regulation should come at the local level. So we will have to have in India, of course, it's work in progress. We don't know how it will ultimately pan out, but as we see, this is the model we think will work for India.
Brilliant. I think that's so well articulated, Sadhana, because I think it captures the need for India to have government involvement, but at the same time, we have to be able to strike that balance between protecting of standards and over-regulation. So this structure, the hybrid structure that both you and Hiro are talking about, makes a lot of sense for the Indian context. Turning to you, Laura, where do you see the role of international organizations like IMI working with governments, working with private organizations, whatever may be the model every individual state adopts? But what is the role of international organizations in implementation of standards?
I think, again, it's a good question. And I think as well, generally, I'm in complete consensus with Hiro and Sadhana. I think they've made some fantastic points about, the need for flexibility and for customizability in particular, right? And so for that reason, mediation can be implemented differently in different states. But where I see the role of IMI, because this is our reason for being, right, to have international standards, is to firstly help in this sort of globalized era, where we have the Singapore Convention on the enforceability of mediator settlement across borders, where we have people doing cross-border work, whether it's face-to-face or whether it's because, you're working with a platform that's in another third-party country. I mean, in those kind of situations, people won't know where else to go to. how do you find a mediator in Uzbekistan? Okay, do you know somebody there? Maybe not. So in those circumstances, you look at an international standard. So it becomes very important. There's another role to play as well, and that is, I mean, I think that with the growth of the regulation described by Sadhana in India and sort of ongoing developments of certification there, this will become less relevant for India. But another role that international standards play is helping where those local standards don't exist at all. Okay, where, you know, it's an underdeveloped mediation market, where there's no difference between, you know, as Hiro said, someone just putting up their placard and calling themselves a mediator, and someone who does have this background, this training, this skill set, right? And so in those sorts of circumstances, a body such as IMI can help to differentiate even locally. And certainly, I mean, even in some countries such as Australia, which, as we know, is my home country, so I have a little fondness there. But we know that there are some standards there, and there's a regulatory body, and yet mediators in Australia seek IMI certification as to differentiate themselves from the market and say we meet not just local standards but international standards. Okay, so yeah, so those two are particularly important. But I would add a third thing on top of the sort of localization on top of the globalized world, and that is the ability to retain independence. And so I think that what Sadhana has just said into this hybrid model, right? So regulation set by government, but perhaps a bit more of an autonomous organization for standard setting. I mean, it reminds me of the SIMI model, and I think could be really promising because there is that need for independence, right? And to that, it's not just about independence from the training organization or from the provider organization, but also perhaps a bit of independence with relation to what mediation is, okay? Because is mediation something which is just done by lawyers? Is it something which is just in the legal and corporate sphere? Is it just done in courts? Or does it also include sort of family mediation done by psychologists or therapists? Does it also include peace mediation? And so I think that's one potential danger with sort of local standard setting, is it can exclude people who are mediators, who do have the skill set, who can help, but they're not recognized. And we see this in some countries. I mean, you mentioned Turkey, and there mediators are required to be lawyers. And so what about these people with this fantastic skill set, which are actually being excluded? And so I would say that those are the three main roles for a body such as IMI. And I mean, it's to that end that, you know, we support governments in regulating and so on. But you did also just mention at the end there sort of enforcement. And I mean, who can enforce these standards, right? Who can enforce this regulation? And I think that actually Hiro is bang on the money in terms of users users actually enforcing standards, all right? I think there is a particular role for them to play and say, well, you know what? Joe Blogs is not good enough, but this person is. And that starts to give us an idea about not just what mediation standards are, but what the maturity of the market is, okay? Because as users start to understand mediation more and more in the process, they're going to have higher expectations, which we want, right? Because that means we're probably going to have better mediation overall. But of course, to that end, we also need to educate users, which becomes very important.
Yep. Fantastic. I'm moving to the next section, which I know our audience is very interested in, and we've had a lot of questions on, which is in the past 6 series, not just on this one, but in the past 6 series that we've had on training. So there is a lot of interest on training. And my first question to you, Hiro, mediation is a skill-based practice. And that said, the 40-hour training program has become the norm for training. There are numerous practitioners out there who feel that the 40-hour training program is inadequate. I'd like to quote Bruce Edwards, who has a training entity, the Edwards Mediation Academy, who's actually written on this. And I like the way he puts it, to quote, "To illustrate the absurdity of minimal training to be proficient in mediation, I often ask my mediation students to envision themselves seated on an airplane and ready to pull back from the gate when the pilot comes on to the public address system and announces, Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Flight 123 to Washington, D.C. You'll be happy to know that I just completed the 40-hour course on piloting this new aircraft, and I'm looking forward to our first flight together. Not exactly confidence-inspiring. So we get the point. Now, question to you, do you think the 40-hour training program is adequate? But that said, it is important to bear in mind that we need to be able to balance out the conflict of not having too many barriers of entry into the profession, but at the same time, holding skill set. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a very rich topic. No, I don't think it's adequate. Obviously, it's not. So the analogy that my mediation mentor used to give was medical school, right? You don't just learn to be a doctor by attending lectures and doing role plays with patients. You know, you actually treat real patients under the supervision of a trained doctor. And that's how you really learn your skills, right? And if mediation really is a skill like that, shouldn't mediators or potential new mediators also go through that kind of supervised training with real cases and real disputants? It's a world of difference doing a role play, right, with a fictional dispute and a real dispute with real lawyers and real clients who are invested in the outcome. And so that, I think, is what really needs to be done more and better, right? You asked about barriers to entry and whether a 40-hour mediation training would be a barrier. I don't think it would be. You know, people study for years to get a degree to enter a profession like medicine or law.
Actually, my question, Hiro, is that if we put in more than the 40 hours, if we have much more, are we creating more barriers of entry? Does the 40 hours create a minimal standard?
Yeah, but if you think about it, even if you doubled that 40 to 80, or maybe even tripled or quadrupled it, it's still less than a semester of work, right? And I guess the point I'm trying to make is that people spend years training to enter different professions. 40 hours, 100 hours, 200 hours is nothing compared to that. So I don't think so. And I think the other point that I would put out there is that, you know, I think in many ways, there aren't enough barriers to entry to the mediation profession. And maybe that will strike some people as controversial and against the grain, but the reality is that it's very easy to sign up for a 40-hour mediation training. But very few of those people will actually be mediating cases. There are lots of people who have done trainings and have had no actual mediation experience at all. Even those who actually get mediation cases, they're not getting a whole lot. I mean, it's, I think, a well-known secret now that there are many, many more mediators out there than there are cases to be mediated, right? And so one of the problems with the 40-hour training is that it's holding out this promise that if you do this training, you'll become a mediator, in an implicit promise. But that's not always going to pan out. I think the more effective trainings are the ones that are done by actual mediation service providers who are able to say, well, if you take our training, at the end of it, you will get a couple of cases and you'll be supervised by, you know, the director of the High Court mediation program, who will see how you actually do in these cases. And depending on that, maybe you'll advance to a next level and start getting more of these cases. So I think that's really where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is once you've done the 40-hour or 100-hour, whatever training it is, you then move to handling real cases under controlled supervision by seasoned, experienced mediators. When I do mediation trainings, when I've been asked to do trainings in different countries, I always ask, what's the follow-up? What happens after I give the 40-hour mediation training? Because if you just leave trainees with that and you don't have a system in place for them to start getting real cases and being supervised in those real cases, it's like, you know, the pilot in your example, right? You've done the 40-hour pilot training or the 400-hour pilot training for that matter, but you still haven't piloted a plane. You know, and so, you know, my sense is that there's a big difference between doing these role plays and doing a real case. And I'd like to have us start thinking a little bit more about maybe even shrinking the mediation training opportunities, because those are already plentiful, right? The real training occurs when you get these actual cases in a more controlled, supervised setting. And that doesn't happen nearly as much as the 40-hour training. So if we could somehow kind of up that, increase those kinds of opportunities, I think that actually would be more helpful.
So to push you a little bit on that, to push you just a little bit on that, what would you consider as a strong foundational training come experience for the purpose of our audience out there who are very interested to learn more? What would you consider as an ideal framework to start calling yourself a mediator?
Yeah, so there's no one right answer to this, right? But if you're asking for my opinion, I think the 40-hour training is fine as a starting point, but it's just a starting point, and I think what you really need is to get a couple of cases under your belt with a seasoned mediator. Maybe it's that you're co-mediating with them, or you're the mediator and they're shadowing you, or maybe you're shadowing a mediator. You need some kind of experience with real cases, I would say. And obviously there's just a limit to how much of that kind of experience can be provided. You have to get consent from the parties to shadow a real mediator, or to be a kind of guinea pig for the mediator in training, right? So it's a very cumbersome process. Yeah. So there's going to be an inherent limit to how much of that we can require. But I think the really good training programs that I know about, so for example, with many of the court annex programs in the US, they'll give you the 40-hour mediation training, and then they'll put you through one of these kinds of real mediation type situations. You'll have a number of them. And then you'll be kind of supervised and monitored as you do your first several cases. And it's really depending on how well you do in those settings that you either do continue to get cases as a mediator on that panel, or you actually end up not getting that many cases, and you remain on the panel maybe, but you just never get any cases. And so I think integrating some of these kind of real disputes in the training is something that's I think critical.
Thank you, Hiro. I think that's very useful and very important for all of us, and especially our audience to hear. Moving to that's, despite this discussion, or along with this discussion, it is critical for us to talk about this 40-hour training program. The fact is that has become a foundation setting when it comes to the first step that one takes to become a mediator. The question to you, Laura, and a question that we get asked a lot, which is, what are the elements that one should be thinking about that constitutes for a good training program? There are so many people interested, and there are so many training programs out there. What should one be looking for to be able to identify a strong training program, strong training as that first step to become a mediator?
Great. Well, I mean, firstly, I have to agree with Hiro that 40 hours is the very first bare minimum, right? So it's the first minimum step. But I'm afraid to disagree with him a little bit about making mediation training less accessible, because I think it depends on your need, okay? And this sort of relates to what kind of training program you go for. Because if you want to do mediation training as just an individual in your own life, maybe you want to become a better communicator rather, the irony of that. Maybe you want to sort of find other ways to resolve your personal disputes, then mediation training should be accessible, right? But if you want to become a professional mediator, then you're looking for something which does meet a higher bar, okay? So, you'll be wanting to look for training that has a meaningful assessment. So it's not just pay to play, okay? There can't be just everybody passes. I mean, and to this end, we at IMI, we do have training criteria for programs, for trainers, coaches, and assessors as well. And they include things like the knowledge and skills that should be tested and imparted. Okay, so people can look at these criteria at any time and say, well, actually, does this program I want to do actually meet these requirements? I mean, but further to sort of the knowledge and skills, it requires that you practice skills, that you practice a reflection. We ask programs or organizations who are submitting their programs, what do you do to help people in their mediation career? Because again, Hiro is completely right. I mean, there's a big difference between getting that initial training and actually starting as a mediator, right? There is that need for mentorship and for guidance and for assistance, which can take many forms. And I mean, so to that, obviously, I mean, I have to say that the programs that do meet IMI standards are on our website. So of course, I would say look there first if I was giving advice, okay? But there's another thing which I think is important to take into account, perhaps in the online world. And because of course, you know, you're right, there's a lot of training that's moving online now. And I mean, at this point, IMI have not recognized fully online training, but you will also find that we've developed criteria for online mediators, okay? And so they list the skills, the knowledge, and the items that are specific to, you know, mediating online, which means you need to learn how to do them as well, okay? And to that end, by the way, if anyone on this webinar today has taken training online, I would invite you to complete a survey for us and actually let us know if you have done your training online, what is it like to be a mediator in the real world? But yeah, I mean, I think I would bring it back to just those things. So firstly, establish what your needs are, and then come to IMI and look at our training criteria and see if your proposed course meets those.
Great, that's helpful that there is a resource out there to help prospective participants to identify what are the essential or strong elements for a good training program. Moving it a little bit on this topic, but on a related point, Sadhana. So once the basic training, skill set or practical experience a mediator undertakes and calls himself or herself a mediator. Thereafter, seasoned mediators like yourself do engage in hours of reflection, in hours of sharing, debriefing, and engaging in continued education, in continued mediation education. How do you see this whole role of continued mediation education playing out in the ecosystem in India? Do we have enough of that going on? Do our mediators need to be engaging in more of a reflective practice? Your thoughts as a seasoned mediator on these aspects of the practice?
I'd like to comment before I answer your question, Tara, a little bit on what Hiro and Laura have said. They've made some very, very vital and crucial points. And I think the point that Hiro has made about co-mediation struck a bell with me immediately, because I'd like to bring in an example here where I feel that for lawyers, the challenge will always be for the non-lawyers who will be coming in, but then we can look at a different kind of training for them in their own domain sphere. But as far as mediators are concerned, I think I'll give you an example of the Delhi High Court, or even Bangalore, or Madras, or Chandigarh. You know, the CAMP-IDEX program is a great laboratory. And so for us, of course, we all agree 40 hours is just the very basic, as Hiro very rightly said. I mean, 40 hours, and that too without an assessment. And that's the point I want to make next that Laura made. Without an assessment, without any accreditation, anyone who comes for the 40 hours program becomes a mediator. That's not going to happen, and it should not. But the CAMP-IDEX program, therefore, in the Delhi High Court, for example, we have about 80 to 100 matters going on in a day. And there are about 60 even today with online mediation. So it's a huge laboratory for mediators who do the 40 hours. So when they complete their 40 hours or even less, then they come into the laboratory. And then they work as co-mediators with a experienced mediator. And they go on with their mediations and co-mediations till they achieve 10 settlements. So that you can, to achieve those 10 settlements as a co-mediator with an experienced mediator, would take you 40, 50, 60 mediations. And then they are taken for an advanced program. And then there are refresher programs. So we have, I think, on an average, something like maybe 300 to 400 hours before a matter is handed over to a new mediator. So of course, it's not perfect. Of course, we need to be better than that. But I think that co-mediation, as far as the lawyers are concerned, lawyer mediators are concerned, the CAMP-IDEX program has that huge advantage of this big laboratory that is available. The other point that Laura made about, accreditation, I think that's critical, because at least there is a basic evaluation by not those who are training you, but those who are objective, who are mediators, experienced mediators who've never met you before, So whether it's a recorded version or whether it's physical version, I think that accreditation in the Indian context is very, very important. And if I may just go back for a few seconds on giving an example of the last segment, which I wanted to do, but I somehow missed, is that of the multi-door courthouse that the Delhi High Court is, where, when a client walks in, there is, and lawyers are all, bar is very sensitized. So the lawyer you go to will guide you, okay, in your case, the appropriate forum is arbitration. In your case, it is mediation. In your case, it is the Lok Adalat or the people's courts. In your case, well, litigation. The other example that the Delhi High Court is the kind of model we were talking about for India. And for example, the Delhi government or the government of the National Capital Territory supports the Delhi High Court's program in terms of finance. So it is funded entirely by the government. The High Court provides the infrastructure and the manpower and the training spaces, etc. The program is overseen by a committee of judges and lawyers, but this is a mediation program that's run entirely by lawyers. So there are elements of self-regulation by the lawyers. There is a committee you can go to if you want a little advice on anything, and then there is the Delhi government that's going to provide you the funds. So I just wanted to bring in that model before I answered your question. Now, to answer the question that you asked me, Tara, I think there'll have to be a paradigm shift, firstly, in the way mediation is conducted today. It's a part-time job. Lawyers will finish their court work, they will finish their conferences for the next day, and then they will come for mediation. That has to change. If we are going to professionalize mediation, and if we are going to have it as and all those standards that Hiro spoke about, he is so right. I mean, even the 300 and 400 hours are not equal to a single semester of what you're studying to become. So you will have to have it as a full-time career. And I think those decisions will have to be made, and that paradigm shift will have to be made. Then mediation institutes like CAMP and service providers like CAMP and others, and there are so many people doing wonderful work in India, they will all have to really wake up and ensure that these standards are set in training. Because when India is poised now to bring in non-lawyers, and rightly so, into mediation, and they'll have a very, there's a huge advantage to that, which we can perhaps talk about a little later. And thirdly, I want to emphasize that it's not just the training, it is not just the full-timeness of the profession, but today we no longer need to debate domain knowledge versus process expertise and all of that, because the kind of laws in the last 8 years that have been introduced in India, I think domain knowledge is a must. Whether it is domain knowledge of the law for the lawyer mediator, domain knowledge of engineering for an engineer mediator, domain knowledge of medicine for a doctor mediator, and so on. So the kind of laws, our legislation has run far ahead of our development in mediation. For example, in 2013, there was an amendment to the Companies Act that introduced the concept of the mediation panel. And this mediation panel is to be maintained by the government, and its the mediation during the pendency of a case, either before the central government or the National Companies Tribunal or the Companies Appellate Tribunal, this is the panel that the parties will be referred to. In 2015, the Commercial Courts Act brought in the concept of mandatory pre-litigation mediation, which is a whole new world.
Right.
Very, very specialized in the world of commercial law. In 2016, we had the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which brought in the role of the resolution professional. And that resolution professional will, though mediation is not specifically provided, but all the skills and techniques of a mediator, the resolution professional needs and can use.
Right.
Then we have the Real Estate Regulation and Development Act in 2016. That's brought in, it's introduced conciliation of disputes through the forums that are to be set up between the consumer and the promoter associations. And one more example, the Consumer Protection Act of 2019, which has introduced court-annexed mediation in consumer cases at the central level, at the state level, at the district level. So this is the kind of specialized legislation that will need domain knowledge, in addition, of course, to process expertise. So these are the points which I want to make on this.
Thank you, Sadhna. So what we're hearing is, as the mediation profession grows and there are these specialized practices that are coming up, it does become important for practitioners to build their process skill as well as their domain skill. And the whole idea that this is a work in progress, that as practitioners, we need to continue our honing our skills to be more effective practitioners is required, especially as this profession grows in India. We have come to our 1 hour mark. Because I promised our audience that at 1 hour, we will open it up for questions. I have a whole other segment on mediation advocacy, but giving full respect to our audience, I am going to take it out to them. Jonathan, are there questions that we'd like to share with our panel at this point of time?
Yeah, thanks, Tara. A lot of brilliant questions coming from the audience. I would like to start off by inviting Brian, who's joining us all the way. Professor Brian is joining us all the way from Newcastle, I believe, to pose this question. I think it was originally directed to Hiro, but Mr. Clark, if you're around, we would like you to unmute and ask your question, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, thank you very much. Just to begin by saying what a terrific discussion. It's been a really fantastic seminar, and I've learned so much about what's happening in India right now with regulation and standards. It's been fantastic. The question that I was asking was one which was prompted by something that Hiro said regarding, he was saying that, leaving it to the market is the way that the US typically does things in terms of standards and mediation. My question was, does it matter that the buyers in the market, we're talking about, let's say, commercial mediation, they might commonly be lawyers, and they may have certain preferences for mediation practice, which might make it harder for others to gain a foothold in the field. So that was the question.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, and it actually dovetails with the mediation advocacy piece that Tara was going to introduce. But I think that in the US, the lawyers have really driven mediation much more than the mediators, right? So when we're thinking about what's the underlying interest in standard setting and so on, is it to regulate mediators, or is it somehow to shape or regulate the mediation process and what we want that process to look like? If it's the latter, then just regulating the mediators is not enough, right? Because you need to start regulating the other actors in the room, and the principal other force there is the lawyers, right? And so I think Brian is entirely correct that in the US, for example, lawyers want evaluative mediators. They want people who've had experience as judges, right? And that has really kind of changed the complexion of mediation in the United States. All of the training in the US started out with a very party-centric facilitative model of mediation. And that basically kind of got thrown out of the window in the commercial space because lawyers who are used to advocating in court and getting evaluations and judgments, wanted mediators who were not facilitative. They wanted directive mediators. And I think that's really changed the face of mediation in the US, such that I think the US is almost now an outlier compared to the rest of the world, which is more, I think, willing to embrace a facilitative problem-solving kind of model. So there are definitely problems associated with that, leaving it all up to the market. The bigger question, I guess, for me is, how much of that can you really control anyway? I mean, I think what we're seeing in a lot of jurisdictions in Africa, in Asia, is that they were all trained in basically a facilitative model, the earlier kind of model that CEDAR used to use. And they're finding that the parties are now still pushing for more evaluative types of approaches, and they're finding that very effective. Hong Kong, I think, is now or has been in the process of thinking through whether evaluative mediation is something they should now push. And we've seen kind of this kind of thinking in other jurisdictions as well. So, I ultimately wonder whether at the end of the day, we would have had a different outcome in the US if we hadn't decentralized things, because I think the end users, particularly the lawyers, are really going to still exert an influence on the complexion of mediation. And that's why I think mediation advocacy training is something that we really ought to think about. When a mediator is asked by a lawyer, can we just skip the joint session and go straight to caucus? Or can you give us an evaluation? Or we need an evaluation. We want you to be more directive. A mediator who's trying to make a living as a mediator and wants to get repeat business, it's very difficult for them to say, well, no, that's not how it's done in mediation. This is how I'm going to do it, right? Mm-hmm. And so mediators are to some degree beholden to the lawyers. And I think if we really want to kind of shape the mediation process, we need to think about the advocacy piece as well.
And on season 2, we promised to have a whole bunch of sessions that is focused on mediation advocacy, because you couldn't have said it better. It is an extremely important piece of the mediation puzzle, that we identify very clearly the role of the lawyer in a mediation, and how a lawyer can effectively use the mediator and the mediation process to the benefit of his client. So to our audience out there, that's going to be the next, the focus of season 2. Go ahead, Jonathan. We have time for a couple more questions.
Yeah, next up, I would like to invite Jawad, who's got a very interesting question. Jawad, if you could quickly pose a question to our panelists today.
Thank you, Jonathan. Now, my question in fact, to all the panelists is that, mediator requires to have some basic qualities like empathy, self-restraint, freedom from, biases like racial, communal, gender biases. Now, obviously, the 40-hour training is not equipped to assess these qualities. So should there be some screening of potential candidates to eliminate candidates who may fit into what we call as high conflict personality types? Actually, Laura has answered by saying that, I hope you don't mind, Laura, if I read out your answer, it's there. She says, Jawad, the very first time I did the Thomas Skillman test, I was the shark. So I've replied that, noted Laura, I was the ostrich. But what I'm talking about are people with very strong biases, gender, caste, communal, racial. For example, a religiously bigoted person may have a strong view on homosexuality or abortion. And what happens if such a person is a mediator in a case where, one of the parties is either gay or, has undergone an abortion?
Great question. Laura, do you want to answer that? Laura, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I really thought I had. I was trying to jump in exactly like a shark, right? And so I think to this idea of like a high conflict personality, just think of their personality as opposed to their values or beliefs or what have you. I mean, I really like to think of mediation as a skill set, so it's a sort of a hack. I mean, you can absolutely live and breathe mediation, okay? If you are someone who is perfectly in tune with yourself and the world around you, and you have no flaws and no ego, then yes, you can be a mediator 100% of the time. but most of us aren't angels, okay? And so I like to think of mediation as a hat you can put on, okay? So once you know how to do it, you can say, all right, I'm in this situation, or I'm trying to help other people. Let me put my mediation hat on. Okay, now let me sort of think past positions, you know, get into interests, get into the needs and what have you. So I think that that's a really important thing when we're talking about, you know, personality types. But to the sort of the second part of your question about should we be screening, you know, if people are really homophobic, or, you know, have particular, like they're racist or what have you, they're xenophobic, or even ageist, okay, sort of all these different isms and what have you, then my take is that this is inconsistent with mediation, okay, because mediation has this underlying prescription that people have value and you're going to be listening to one another. Because if you did not believe in those two things, then you would not be trying to find a mutually beneficial agreement or a preferred agreement. And you're probably not going to go to mediation. So if you're a mediator that, you know, actively thinks that, for example, gay people shouldn't exist, or really outrageous things like this, then for me, it really makes me question why you are a mediator. It seems very cynical to me, okay? Maybe that's a little judgmental. Maybe they are able to still set themselves aside. Maybe they can avoid those cases, but for me, it really raises the question of why they became a mediator at all.
It's such a good question. And I guess the question Javad asks is, if there are people out there who do want to be mediators, should there be a process that screens them out? Sadhana, your thoughts, and then Hiro. I'm sure, especially in our context, where there are so many issues, I mean, in any context, there are so many issues. How do you, as a training, as a lead trainer, approach these issues?
Yeah, Javad, that's a very good question. And I agree with Laura that such a person, then what's such a person doing, wanting to be trained as a mediator? But the question is, who decides? Who decides that such a person has this sort of potential or the lack of it? In screening, there is, yes, you can, and we do invite applications, and then we look at potential personalities for mediation in the CAMP-IDEX programs. We do that. We do that irrespective of other things. You know, all prejudices and biases and stereotyping is part of the assessment of selecting a candidate. But then the result, I would say, of screening, we've not always had the kind of result we thought we would have. Because people have come across with certain personalities when they were being screened, they were being interviewed. And you find that when they actually get into mediation, then all those things have vanished. And there's a new person who's mediating. It's not the same person who came for the interview and projected himself or herself as such a secular thinking person. So you know those dangers are always there, Javad. But you are right. And we're talking the Indian context. It is crucial that in the Indian context, what Laura said, in our context, we can't afford to have people who have these biases. And, you know, the examples that you gave, whether it is religious or whether it is sexual orientation or whatever it is, we can't have mediators in India. But the challenge is that how do you decide, and who decides? And are you right in your decision? Very often I have found that my assessment of a particular potential person to be trained as a mediator has been very wrong at the end of it. So we'll have to see by trial and error. I think, Javad, you've raised a very important issue, and I think we should keep it as work in progress and also be transparent about discussing these things with potential mediators. And sometimes in mid-career, a mediator suddenly develops a bias, suddenly develops a prejudice, suddenly surprises you by a view that they're expressing you didn't think they would ever have. And that is why when Tara said this continuing education, this continuing sensitization, this continuing training, and the trainers also exposing themselves, you know, we have to sharpen our saws first. If I am not physically fit, emotionally fit, socially fit, spiritually, by which I don't mean religious, if I'm not fit myself, how am I going to train the others? So we also need to look at ourselves as trainers and make sure that we are going through the cleansing process ourselves also.
Fantastic.
Because there can be a lot of subjectivity in all this, you know.
Yeah. Hiro, you wanted to add to this very pertinent question?
If we have time, yeah. So Javad raises a kind of very interesting question. Can you be a racist and a mediator or something like that, right? And, you know, I guess I want to disagree a little bit with my co-panelists about this. Not that I'm endorsing racism or homophobia at all. But the reality is that there are very, very effective racist mediators out there. There are people with all sorts of biases and prejudices out there. And I think the idea that we as mediators can be biasless or prejudiceless is really kind of unrealistic, right? Biases and prejudices arise in all sorts of different ways. We may have a preference for the plaintiff versus the defendant, or we may have a sense as the mediation unfolds that one party has a much stronger case than the other, or one party's being unreasonable. And, you know, our neutrality is always getting challenged in these ways. And so to some degree, I think that the racist or homophobic example is a little bit of a straw man. It's very easy to say, of course, we don't want people like that being mediators. But the reality is that there are effective mediators out there who don't share our political and social and other kinds of beliefs. And I think, you know, one of the tenets of mediation is that we should be open and try to understand and include people that we actually disagree with, and listening and being open to them is not necessarily agreeing with them. And I think the other point is that, you know, in a lot of mediations, it's not really about listening to other people, right? I mean, I've been involved in lots of mediations where the parties and the lawyers, they just don't want to listen to the other side. They didn't come to listen, they came to settle their case. Right? And so sometimes you don't need those kinds of listening skills. Sometimes you need other kinds of problem solving skills. So I think this goes back to the fundamental question that we started with, which is that it's very difficult to pin what mediation is, right? Mediation is an inherently flexible process. And I think we need to take a more kind of inclusive, big tent approach to mediation. Otherwise, we risk excluding voices that, you know, may seem obviously problematic to some people, but actually their inclusion might be vital in ways that we can't expect. So one, you know, clear example is lawyers being mediators, right? In some jurisdictions, like some have noted, like Turkey and Argentina, you know, you have to be a lawyer to be a mediator. And to some people that's obvious, right? But who are you excluding by doing that? So I think it's a very important question. Again, I'm not trying to condone racism or homophobia, or even trying to suggest that we should have racist mediators. But I do think we need to be very careful about what we think of as the ideal type in mediation, because there are risks and downsides to having that kind of type and excluding certain voices because of that.
And actually, if I can just add one final comment, actually, because I think it wraps this up, is that maybe this does, at the end of the day, relate to, as Hiro said, what mediation is. I mean, maybe if you're sort of working in those more evaluative ends of mediation, where you're less focused on actually transforming the underlying relationship, then those biases aren't so problematic. But if you're looking at the more transformative end of mediation, where it is so important to sort of, develop that trust and build that relationship and have open terms of conversation, maybe there it does become more problematic to have these biases within the media themselves.
Yeah, and I guess all I'm saying is that a non-racist, non-homophobic mediator can also have lots of biases, right, that affect the process in a whole lot of other ways. And so when we just focus on the racists, you know, we potentially are forgiving the non-racists who might be biased in a whole host of other crucial ways.
That is why I wanted to underline who decides, you know, it's not an easy answer.
And at the end of the day, to also remind ourselves that mediation is a voluntary process. And at the end of the day, it's the client who decides. And if this mediator is presenting himself as biased, as impartial, the client does have the power to walk out of that process. And that's a very important aspect of the power of this process that needs to be noted to balance out these imbalances that are inevitable with human beings playing different roles. So great question, Javad, thank you. And unfortunately, you've been a fantastic panel, a fantastic audience that has been so engaged. We have so many questions. We are going to try and answer as many of these questions as we can. I did mention to all of you that today is the last session of season 1. We hope to have a season 2 by the support and encouragement that we've had from all of you. I'm quite sure we will have a season 2, but I'd like to bring on board Vikas Vij, who has been our partner through this, who's been a strong supporter of mediation. He leads IDEX Legal. I'd like to have Vikas show his face so we all know the man behind the power of this collaboration. So thank you, Vikas, and a few words as we close, as we have the privilege of closing season 1.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, panelists. It's very dark here because I'm in UK, but the light hasn't shone through because it's grey and dull, so I think it's quite dark. But it's been a great panel, and I've really enjoyed listening to this conversation in the background and just talking about how mediation can play such a fundamental role, especially in India. And I know Tara and Layla have done a great job last 5 years of building up CAMP, driving home this conversation around mediation. And it's been really exciting for us to work together in partnership to put this series together. It's something we've been talking about for a while, and we managed to put it together pretty quick in the end in the last couple of months. And it's exciting to hear about season 2 as well. So we're really looking forward to how we can plan that out, even developing other ideas around the training, that has been discussed on the program. So, we're really kind of brainstorming how we can drive home, mediation as a real significant tool, for the market in India. And it's been a pleasure, working with Tara, working with CAMP, and just and listening to the panelists over the last couple of months. So thanks for being part of the, being in partnership with us as well, Tara.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. We couldn't do it without the support of all of you. So stay in touch with us at CAMP. Jonathan is available anytime.
I was going to come in there, Tara. Just a quick remark. They're going to be making a report of all our sessions with the recordings, summaries, and maybe a few clippings, and also the Q&As, which some of them we have to still get back to you with. So we're going to make sure we have a nice report sent to all of our attendees at the end of all this, together working with IDEX Legal on this project. And I know they're already teasing you with season 2, but yeah, once again, it's been a pleasure. Tara, you may have the last words.
Thank you all. Good luck. Stay safe. And we look forward to reconnecting with you over season 2. But before then, to be in touch with us, to all work collaboratively to get mediation as part of our dispute resolution landscape. Our planet needs it. Our legal system needs it, and it can only be done with all of us working together to make mediation that default mode of dispute resolution. So thank you, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
We can stop recording now.
Yeah, you stop recording.